you can say how many, oh, good point, thank you. You can always say how many things are in a room, because there's so many tables, chairs, atoms, whatever. That's a discrete, if not calculable, but it's a number. But how can you say how many inches there are in this room? Inches of what? You see, measure is applicable infinitely. And we've evolved a monetary model of security that matches what we think the territory is. So it should be scarce and gold or something. The best money is the most scarce thing you can rely upon. Well, that sticks us way down on one end of the map and the territory. The real point about money is that it is a social construction, and that it's like inches or kilograms or degrees centigrade. It's a measuring thing. And if we try and say the measure is the gold or diamonds or something of scarcity, then we trap ourselves into using a scarcity model to manage our interactions in a complex and high variety space. So that's the big one for me, is don't get tied to a literal understanding of scarcity to organize our world, because it isn't scarce. And that for me is where it sort of started, and it hasn't stopped yet. So I'll let you know when I get to the end of it.
Gail, did you have something that you wish to add there before I
just wanted
with my line of questioning?
Thanks. I just wanted to tie that back to the current conventional model of exchange, which is all about the store of value being scarce and issued by somebody who makes sure that it's scarce so that it stays valuable. So it's in limited quantity.
Yes. Okay. So there are two directions in which I kind of would like to take this. The first, I suppose, just to explore some of the work that you have done already and to get everybody further acquainted with some of the ways in which this recognition that the measure is not valuable itself and we ought not to make that scarce in the world, because it really hampers our ability to exchange the things which are really valuable, which really make human life meaningful, which enable transaction, which enable relationship, which enable reciprocity and the full expression of like human value in the world. I would like just to start perhaps like by talking a little bit about the notion of community currency, perhaps in the narrow sense that you have thought about it in open money, in terms of paying, perhaps cash for the like cost price of goods and services, but then thinking more about community currencies for value added and for the amortization of costs over time in communal trade, particularly in local environments.
Generosity and gratitude, really. That's the area for me. Is when we deal in conventional money, we're treading on each other's blood supply. We're infringing our own needs. We live in a sort of a survival economy where the way that I play is that I've got a job or an income, but then I spend that and I need more money coming in. And that's the barrel that we've often used as the indicator for conventional understandings of what I've got. Now, what you've got, you've got your barrel. And when we engage in a transaction, either I'm going to employ you to do something or buy something from you, we're in an opaque space where we don't actually know what the other person's surviving on or got, and we don't know how much we're damaging them by getting a good price. And there's a recent satisfaction of conversations. Most people apparently leave conversations unsatisfied because they didn't get their point across, or they didn't understand the other person. Well, we're operating in that same level with conventional money. Is, did I get a good deal? Could he have given me a better deal? Did I get enough out of him? How much have I entailed? You know, there's that anxiety through an opaque screen. I don't know what your situation is. I don't even really know what mine is, but I've got to mind my inventory and my survival. And I'm compromising mine if I give you too much latitude, if I'm too generous, because the return of that money is not in any way systemic, because money in the conventional sense goes away. I spend it and it's not mine anymore. So we're in this space of uncertainty about how we're actually interacting with each other. And it's like that conversation business, you know, who leaves a conversation with satisfaction? Who leaves a transaction with satisfaction? Now, the proposition we have is that if we can take the addictive component of our fear-based assertion that money's going to need it for the mortgage, need it for the rent, that level of how big is my barrel, how much is yours. If we can level that off and not drain each other's barrel. There's a line from T.S. Eliot, which I can't remember where it's from, Gail, but we looked up the other day. Why do you come together as a community? Is it to make money from each other? And if you look at most of our commercial behaviors, it's, you know, where's the location? Where is the market? Where is the activity? And we're bringing people together to get from each other. Because we need to get from each other, because who else is going to look after it? Now, what we discovered with our approach was, if we make a community connective process of giving, or making it possible to give, so that the action is acknowledged, you know, thanks for fixing my car, here's 400 community dollars. It's not like an IOU, a debt, an enforceable contract. It's a measure of what I recognize as your service to me, and I will pay it forward. That's a loose frame, but the Eric Frank Russell story says it so beautifully. Is the opportunity to participate in a community is not a coercive and a demand and an expectation. And most of the habits we have about money is, how good is that money? Will this money get me something? What will I get with this money? Can you promise me that I will get? Now that's an insidious relationship builder. If instead we have a method of acknowledging gift in a systemic way that builds patterns, and that's why we found this closure to a resonant community. You know, what we do in our neighborhoods and our families is pretty resonant because it's nearby and it's physical and it's meaningful. But what we do on wider basis is not resonant, it's extractive and destructive if we're using the conventional stuff. So we're looking for finding that resonance in multiple scales, sizes, areas, where the money isn't a compulsion, it's an opportunity. I think that's about it, Gail. Any comments, Gail, on that?
That covers a lot of territory and a lot of kind of a high level abstract view of it. So, I don't know whether everybody is au fait with all of the concepts, although I know there are a good many people here interested in currency design and community exchanges. I just wanted to reiterate the idea of the competitive exchange, that we're always worried about how much we're going to get or how much we have to give when we're using this money that has been designed essentially to do that. There's historical evidence now that we're bringing forward since David Graeber's books and other sources to recognize that there's great value in kind of guiding communities into being at odds with each other by the use of this money. You can subjugate people just as easily as you can pay your troops by offering money that has to be used in this way, or that taxes that have to be paid in this money. So there's a lot of colonial and imperialist kind of energy behind this type of exchange, and other ways involve not taking from but giving to. We just want to explore that some more. Michael, I just wanted to ask also.
Yeah, giving to but not risking.
Right.
That's the big issue, is that if we're jeopardized by our generosity, then that can be damaging. But if we can be generous to each other without compromising our own well-being, then we're in good place. And that's why we're suggesting be nice to each other, don't harm each other by threatening our survival in this addictive economy. The Globalization of Addiction is a book that was published in 2008 out of downtown East Side experiences in Vancouver, which are, of course, are related to pharmacological drugs and that necessity cycle. But we've got an entire world that's based upon addiction to need. Got to have the money, otherwise can't pay the mortgage, etc. And so it's that need which basically restricts our ability. And the thing that I was very delighted to see in the work that you've been doing, Andy, and this group as a whole, is this idea that we can be generous, and reciprocity. That reciprocity is the closing of a pattern that is generous. That's probably as succinctly as I can confuse the matter even further.
Wonderful. I see a hand from Charles, and we will ask him to ask his question first, and then from Philip, and then I'll come back with some thoughts about measures and games. Charles.
Oh, thank you all. I'm just real glad to be here. Glad it worked out so spontaneously. And I don't know if I'm sort of literally out of turn in regard to agenda and sort of how you want to. You guys are already sort of huddled around the flow of this, but just to put a flag up for it could be later. But also to touch on actually what was said just before, Michael, you started coming around yourself, where you were mentioned, and actually Philip was there, and a few of us with regard to Susie Kavanaugh and what she was describing from some years ago with her students in the classroom and the games around money. And so just to kind of, as a counterpoint, if you will, and I think at least a little bit, at least before we finish today, and in general, just got my popcorn here for the fireworks ongoing. But there's a kind of very simple, elegant, and I guess probably still rudimentary game or sort of toolkit or what have you that you've had and built for quite some time, and I think it's sort of ripe and ready. And so, hands-on, as opposed to like, a lot of conversation, then there's actually a way to literally experience it and talk about it, I suppose, in the process. But, so I just wanted to point to this kind of other end of the spectrum of learning, of co-learning. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. We're going to take a look at that game in just a moment. And it's well pointed to. So Philip, would you stir in the stone soup, whatever ingredients you brought with you from Amsterdam?
you can get all kind of ingredients in Amsterdam. It's lovely to see you again, Michael. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm on vacation this week. Of course, I'm going to join this conversation. I'm going to the question, because we've talked about it over the years, I've struggled to get this scarcity thing into my, grey matter. And it's probably because of something you wrote in 1987 in the Whole Earth Review. And the sentence that sticks out for me there is that money is an information system we use to deploy human effort, which is not unlike the phrase that Andy pulled out from your more recent writing. There's a lot of similarity there. And of course, information has no scale and has no scarcity. I get that, but it's when you say to deploy human effort, because human effort is finite, right? There is a limit to it.
Yeah.
So do you find that there's part of me thinking that that's not necessarily a counter argument to your point on scarcity, but it's still something I struggle with cognitively.
Had we but worlds enough and time, world enough and time.
If human effort is finite, because each of us only has 168 hours a week, how do you get around the scarcity bit?
By steering, basically, by feedback information in the loops that allow you to see what you're doing sensibly. There's all sorts of scarcities in the world, scarcities of space, time, energy, material, space of intelligence, space of goodwill. So as we look at how do I spend the day and where's my energy going, feedback is really useful. And this is where I think the VSM model, the Stafford Beer's work on the organization of information at different levels in a community are really important. It's feedback in the right places. And that's been, you don't get rid of what is scarce, but you don't impose a scarcity, a monoculture, one money to rule them all. Everything is equated in, it goes here or it goes there, and that's it. We've got a variety of channels. It's like having 20 instruments in your orchestra rather than just one. These are illusions and the metaphors, I know, but I don't know another way to deal with it.
Metaphors are all we have. So maybe we all struggle on with them.
Does it help you to understand, Philip, or is this?
Yeah, I guess I've heard that description before. I guess for me, the idea of these community currencies sitting alongside more traditional forms is, I can understand why that's how they can complement each other. But there's something in that metaphor, that spatial metaphor, that doesn't work for me. They're not alongside. It's almost as if the information flows we're all obsessed with here that don't have any reference to fiat money or Austrian economics. It's almost as if they're more fundamental. They're underneath. They're operating at a different level, on a different ontological plane, or however you want to put it. I'm still struggling to put my own understanding on Michael's work. I'm failing miserably.
Well, let me know. I feel the pain myself. Yeah.
If you start by suggesting that there are two different ways of considering how to give and get something, and you have an idea that is not rivalrous, an exchange that is not rivalrous, you can't use a rivalrous money to make that exchange, is our assertion. How then do you make a non-rivalrous exchange? Well, in a business setting, you would take the part of it, the part of the value being exchanged, that is not something that I need to survive, and allow that to be in a different currency. So instead of the cost of goods, which we have to have as cash because we can't supply our, we can't pay our suppliers, we can't pay our insurance, whatever. The cost of goods has to be respected. But if you look at the markup beyond that, that is something we can be generous with. That is something that can work into a currency that essentially can stay in the loop of the network rather than having to go outside it to pay for all of those other kinds of costs, the insurance, the supplier of auto parts. But if I fix your car, I can do what I want with my service to you. As long as I get the money for the parts, I'm still okay to pay my own rent. Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you. Yep, thank you very much. I won't hug the mic a moment longer.
Yeah, we love it when you hug the mic. And I know. I want to go to Christina just because topic of information flows, generosity, reciprocity, and the space in which we have to be generous as it relates to natural law is something I adore hearing you speak about. And I'm terribly biased and deeply disordered. So we'll come to Ray after that. Forgive me, please.
I appreciate you all so deeply. I just, it's almost like an opposite game, right? For me, when I think when you were talking about the cost of goods and respecting the costs of goods, I think what's invisible to us as a culture that's searching for a language that is articulating the richness of our environments, right? So I think the true cost of goods, if we pay attention to the fact that we need to return to the soil, and that in that returning, from getting rid of the word waste, for instance, like there is no waste, right? If that waste was somehow seen as the return resource that allows for the engine of like a regenerative engine, then I think start to see then reciprocity becomes visible, because we've suddenly put value on the return, which is part of the cost of goods. And then suddenly we're like faced with abundance. And then like, what do you do with the fact that I have 1 billion melons and 3 neighbors? So I guess that's all I've got to say about that.
Thanks so much. And Ray.
Add one thing I didn't hear anyone say that was helpful to me, and I just don't think it was mentioned, which is really to think about money as being a sort of information technology or a communication technology that is part of an ecology that we end up being in symbiosis with. How we make our money really helps to drive all that hustling and hard bargaining and being concerned about ourselves, not worrying about the repercussions for the other party, that's inherent in the interaction between people and money, the way that it exists.
Yep.
And in much of the world, we actually only have one money. And you can imagine if we only had one internet communication technology, if we only had the internet, or God forbid, we only had Facebook, or we only had Slack. I mean, it would change the way that we interact, because it would be guided down the rails of what that communication technology or social media says. And we're doing the same thing with our money. And if we imagine money as being flexible and able to be reimagined the way that we imagine social media and other communication technologies, we might start to think about how it really opens up, shifting how we are with each other by designing the money to be the way we want it to be.
Okay. Amazing. Really just incredible. That it takes us into the next step in the conversation, perhaps, Michael, which is speaking about the difference in your models between simple and complex currencies. And perhaps if you wanted to touch on Nest in regard to those things, the ability to, the topic for the discussion is informing money, we make our world, right? Which is exactly what Ray has just said so beautifully and eloquently. And I wonder, like, can you describe a little bit about what simple and complex monies are? And we can perhaps spend a little time in this notion of, namespaces, vectors, and other things which might allow us to think more deeply about diverse kinds of information flows that do contribute to an ecology of value, an ecological way of valuing, and the sort of relationships that are implied in that.
I'm going to be quite incoherent quite a lot of the time because I'm getting old, and these things are so widely interconnected that complexity and simplicity are beautifully related. The issue is a systems issue of, do you probe and get a result, or do you try and prescribe and predict? And that's the general mechanism is what can I assure? What can I get right? The general answer is virtually nothing. But any form of feedback is useful. And if my actions in my community feed back quickly and accurately, then that's likely to create a collective behavior. The we-ness of how is this all happening is not to be organized from the top down. It has to emerge from the from the behavior of the individual agents, the flock of birds flying, or the herd. There's a centrality, but a dispersion, and it's all individuals who are doing what they're doing inside their frames. And of that, you have the group. And I've seen an awful lot of attempts to create group behavior by prescription and rules and structures. That's what I'm looking for, is the simplicity that generates complexity, because it's got high variety and no limitations inherent in the package. If we had free speech, but only with words issued by the government, or if we could have ink, but it came from the government and you only got so much of it for your printer and it was always black and white, then we wouldn't have color. We're in this position of seeing a black and white financial universe, control, top-down scarcity, who's got it, they've got a voice. If you don't got it, you got to do what you're told. And this has been the management of our socio-political societies, the nation state. Well, we don't have to do that. We can make our own pictures. We can use our own information. We can have this soft resonance of mutual appreciation inside a group, which is basically how tribes, bands, smaller societies have operated for a long, long time. Now, one of the lines on this is the Dunbar line. Thank you again, Philip. Getting beyond the Dunbar number. We keep looking at the evidence that we can only extend comfortable trust in certain scales and ratios. So the Dunbar numbers for small groups, for mid groups, for on up. But we've extended our visual faculties with microscopes and telescopes. We have telephones, we have technologies that extend the human capacity. This McLuhan, right? The medium is the message in that respect. Well, we need forms of social organization that reflect humanity, but aren't limited by the Dunbar numbers of the cognitive system. We can tool ourselves into being much more harmonious, much more aware of the externalities of our individual behavior and our group process. If we have feedback loops that come back, it's the looping that comes back. It's the resonance in the space, which I was started in electrical engineering and physics and Shell. I was in Amsterdam myself many times. And it's all about feedback loops. And if you don't know what's feeding back, then you just operate without regard to anything around you. But if it comes back to you, and this is where we really got very excited with promise theory. Mark Burgess got a very, very well described, delineated, what can you expect from a promise? Well, you can expect what shows up. Because a promise is just a promise. It is not a contract. It is not a deliverable. But we've tried to build our world on you deliver or I come and sue you. And the costs of that are appalling. It's our entire legal structure, it's our property structure, it's our entitlement, it's our desire for assurance and do I know what I'm going to get? And how stupid can we be? We have no idea what's going to come until it comes round and comes back. And it's those resonant feedback loops that make sense to me from electrical engineering, from signal systems, from social systems, from computers. I saw a really nice thing about getting back towards analog computers, which are a damn sight more subtle and manageable than digital computers. And indeed, when I was just finishing my first degree, it was at that intersection between analog and digital. And I like the analog so much more than the digital. I rabbit on. I pass it back to, please ask a question.
Good reason for that.
Tiny
Charles.
prompt to tag on, just because I'm an audio guy, among other things, and that sort of also traversed the era of analog to digital somewhat, and or largely, but there's hybrid. I mean, it's sort of now they're inseparable, at least in audio, in practice, and so maybe there's some kind of middle way there. It's not really either or, actually.
No,
So.
no. Yeah, it's sort of male female. It's a bit like the book McGilchrist, the Master Emissary, the left brain, right brain. The modalities of different operating systems, one of them are distinctive and separate. Draw a distinction. Be clear, this is that and that is this. And then the other brain is the inclusive. It's the gestalt of the process. And that's what's been the keystone for me for 60 years now, is the difference between distinction and integration. Differentiate, integrate. You've got to have them both. You've got to have the male and the female. You've got to have the receptive and the creative. We keep locking onto the one that gives us a quality of predictability, we believe, which is control, left brain. What do I get? Well, we need to shift into that. I don't know, because I'm going out into the unknown, the cloud of unknowing in this area.
I have a number of comments about this, but I do want to just invite Christina first, please.
I love this conversation so much. I'm interested in bringing in a consideration of seasonality, simply because when you take time and you sort of stretch it, or you are more inclusive, and let's also talk about time in relationship to patterns, right? So I'm a natural farmer, and the teacher that I follow, he said once, you know, you do something and you fail, and you do it again based on the feedback loops that you've received, the information you've received from that first attempt, and you fail. The third time you're ready to go, you've got all your feedback loops, you know, you've honed it down, you do it again and you fail. But what emerges from that is an actual pattern. And that's what's important, is that pattern. And then bringing seasonality into it, I just want to, like, what I'm learning now is like each season is a complete feedback loop in itself. And so if we pay attention to the seasonality and we come to this kind of interesting completion of a pattern, and we just then with time and with the practice and with succession as community, then that's where the cohesion comes, and that's where the coherence comes. And then we can start to tease apart these patterns a little bit easier.
Yeah, lovely. It is about, I came across something that said that the word sin derived from archery in Aramaic. It was like, what was my sin? 4 inches to the left or a cubit too high or whatever. It was the measure of divergence. It was the feedback that allowed you to zone in on your target. So it was not an ethical thing in the morality. That came later: guilt, shame, fear, and religion. Hooray. But in the beginning, it was, did I hit or did I miss, and how much? And when you look at serious scientific method, and here I'd rely upon Feynman, Dyson, that world of ask a question, propose an answer, test the answer, and go round and go round and go round. And the more you fail, the better. Because the accuracy is actually the problem. Now, I'm famous for this because I've failed in more things than most people have ever thought about. I'm a serial failure, and I'm glad of it, because if I was successful, I'd have grabbed onto things. Whereas I found it far better to play in the whirlpool, the smoke ring of uncertainty, because you know, what do you know? Then you're outside and you're looking at it. That's the subject object. But if you're part of the flow, how do you know? One of the most powerful things I've learned from several teachers is, if you think you're doing it right, you're not. As soon as you think you're meditating, you're not. In Alexander technique, it's the first rule: don't do it again. Let the reality create your experience and your relationship to it. So uncertainty, continual uncertainty, seems to be the nature of life. Certainty is dead.
But it's also a generous uncertainty.
Yes, vital.
And so the I don't know, the apple tree, when it drops apples onto the ground and ends up feeding many creatures by that, isn't certain what it's going to get in terms of, I don't know, what the animals do with the ground as they stand around eating the apples. But the apple tree eventually gets fertilized. And there's no certainty about how much or when, but it does happen.
Okay, there's some very fascinating points made in the chat which refer to our friend Dave Snowden. But before going to the Welshmen and how they discovered America first, which was a hilarious part of those videos for me, I wanted to touch, there's something really interesting here for me before we move further perhaps into promises, obligations, and then there were none, Gandhi, Satyagraha, and some of the really interesting stuff which happened there. I just want to touch on one thing here, because there's something really interesting about these feedback loops, in the sense that in terms of how they apply to the pay it forward mentality that you talked about in the beginning of the call. And the reason that I bring this up is because I've been chatting with Nathan Schneider on and off, and he sent a paper to me, which was published this month. Some academics once again de-anonymizing Bitcoin, which is a lot of fun to kind of go in and look at. And these academics, being, you know, really good Western academics, were surprised that there were only kind of 64 key agents in the early Bitcoin network, and that all of them continually made the decision to cooperate rather than take the proceeds of the network and run. And what they do is they model it as an end centipede game, and they have a fancy mathematical description of why this might be the case and what kind of sub-game Nash equilibria comes up and how that was avoided, particularly within the anonymity of the early community. And they're like, oh, this is so surprising, you know. But if you go and read the work of Lewis Hyde, or if you look at any indigenous philosophy, when gifts are given anonymously, it doesn't limit the manner in which they are given back. It expands your obligation. Your obligation is now not to a person who has given you a gift that you must in some way return. Your obligation is to the world, that the roots of that generosity that you're pointing at is nothing other than the world at large, if we can talk about it that way. And so I just want to understand and hear you speak perhaps a little bit more about, see, these feedback loops are not like me to you and back again in a dyad. There's something more triadic, or in potentially like further. And I'd love to understand how you think about that feedback loop in the pay it forward model, and how that might apply to like currencies and generosity.
Very deeply, because the gift is a serious problem. There's a really nice book by Margaret Visser on gratitude and gift. I can't remember the precise title, but it points out that gifts in different countries are very different. If you're in Tokyo and you're going to visit somebody, you bring a gift and you apologize for how meager your gift is. It's so, you know, because of course the other side is, oh, now we've got to do something for them. Whose turn is it? You know, and that's the dyadic nature of giving. Am I ahead? Have we kept up with the Joneses? You know, by breaking that dyadic lock, we can get into the pay it forward cycle. Now, but if it's not paid forward, both in some form of resonance, whether it's perceived or not, but it should be resonant, and more particularly, if it's a gift that is given with expectation of reward, it's tarnished. There's Robin Wall Kammerer's book, Sweetgrass, as the best description of the gift cycle, the gift process. And she said at one point, I think it's that if the gift is not realized by the giver, I'm going to mess it up too much, but it's that point that you were asking about, Christina, about the, well, I don't know if it was Christina who was asking, but this wholeness of that it's got to relate to all my relations, right? That's the line, isn't it? It's not my preferred relations, right? That's splitting things up. But if what is given is appreciated, is not carrying the demand of reciprocity, either from the individual or the group, then it is a gift. Now, if I go into gift at the bargaining level, like I'll give you something if I get something back. I don't know if you know the Kubler-Ross stages of death, you know, and there's the bargaining phase. The bargaining phase, well, if I accept that I'm dying, will it go away? No, but we keep trying to bargain with things. And the point of a gift is it isn't a bargain. It is a gift, and it's a gift to all rather than just the favored few, and there's externalities to the poor people in other worlds, which would take us back to first world, second world exploitation by the colonizers, you know, that's a big story. We don't account for all the consequences in the balance sheet. It doesn't show up.
Yes, we are big fans of Robin Wall Kimmerer. You'll find it all across Kernel. There's a summary of braiding sweetgrass and two most delightful essays from her. One on in the Orion magazine about our rights to care for the land, which is a fascinating one and related to Onondaga Lake and the ecological disaster that has turned out to be, and also the service-berry economy, which I think is directly related to this discussion, and I will drop a link to that in a moment. But I want to just take us to where I promised Charles we would get to, which is the notion of running these kinds of experiments and how that is really beautifully and interestingly achieved, particularly within the realm of education. So Michael has a game that he has designed called Sea College, and please correct me, that I would be really happy if you would discuss a little bit here. And I just want to frame this a little bit further, because these, like Charles is right that it's wonderful to play the game and actually see the effect that different currency designs can have on the manner in which we transact, which is much more like easy to see and feel than it is to like have an abstract discussion about. And the reason that I think that this is interesting is because educational arenas are the most wonderful place to play with this kind of stuff. And it would be really fascinating to me on a very, very practical level to run each kernel block with a different kind of currency, for instance, right? Like it would be very interesting to like play with that. And it doesn't have to be on, you know, like a production, it doesn't have to be on mainnet or anything, but we can like have our own kind of currency for each block and see what happens. That to me is like a very interesting potential out of these like conversations. And I just wanted to mention that now because like it does like put a bit of a stake in the ground and say, yes, I mean, we're very much, everybody has a deep interest here in information flows or ecology or the sort of coherence, crystallization of those two things. But where do we recognize it? Well, in educational games is like a really good place to perhaps start. So Michael, if you would talk a little bit about Sea College and then also about like why games and why wind tunnels for currencies. Where does this blow us?
Okay, first, CC College is a concept. It's not the game itself. It's the idea of an information base. It's the old collegiate deal. Like, you know, you gather together and you work on things and you find out. And at the end of it, somebody gets a label and said, oh, you've passed a degree or whatever. And it's that level of affirmation of useful experience. Now, the components of a CC college, which community currency colleges, would be active exploration in the real world, informed by modeling, informed by projection, informed by multivariate testing, i.e. the sort of the wind tunnel for community currencies. And we've had a conversation with somebody who was asking for this particular question. They found out how to work with a segregated community, be it a city in a region or whatever. And he's asking, how many other edge effects are there? How many islands are there in the world? How many tribes? And how does each tribe play with the space of its surroundings? Now, what we're looking for in the concept of a game for elementary school, middle school, high school up, and going in that direction, is an opportunity to play with multiple patterns simultaneously. It's sort of the harmonics of many things happening at once. Rather than trying to box it off into absolute limited variable package, the sort of scientific distinction. We want to provide platforms and opportunities to try multiple things with a sort of almost like a test bed. I mean, how fast is your CPU? What's the bandwidth on this channel? We've got measures for that in all sorts of technical areas. We can measure flotation, we can measure lift on a wing, but we haven't devised good ways of comparing different currencies with each other. Now, we've had one game called the Let's Play game. This will probably not show up too well, but it's on our websites and so on. And it shows that a Pareto game, a Pareto distribution of there's only so many dollars in this game. Well, they'll come into some of the rich and therefore there are poor. You see, rich and poor must coexist in a distributed scarcity commodity money. But in a give and take, in a flow from side to side of a positive negative chart, then you've got a very different dynamic. And now that's what we're looking for, is for the ability to explore these in many dimensions, because although we've had this game for quite a long time, it's not been effective unless you can basically get people to play it, which is not easy. There's a barrier, there's an uncertainty, there's a resistance. And we want a game that has no resistance because it's easy for kids, it's easy for a student in a university to bring this analysis to their teachers and say, yeah, but what's happening? So we're looking for, and the wind tunnel is the sort of closest analogy that I can offer in there. It's available, it's obscure, and it's not easy to get. We're going to try and bring it in with the, the Spotted, this game, Fano Plains. There's
we know it as Dobble in parts of the world. Dobble.
Yeah, you'll find a reference in the notes we've sent up. And
over here it's called Memory. It's my kid. Okay. It's a kid's game.
Yeah, but it's a great way of taking a diverse group and splitting it into two sets with one connection between them. In every one of these cards in this set, in this thing, this is an order 7 game, which means that on each card, you pick any 2 cards from this set, and 7 of them are different, and 1 is the same. Do you see the overlap? I'm not looking at it, so I can't tell you. Who sees the overlap first? It may be unintelligible. But
hold it a little closer to the camera.
I'll do something even smarter than that. I'll switch to this. See, this is why you shouldn't let me drive. Is it working yet? No, it's not.
So just I had a quick question, which is about the name Let's Play. Maybe you want to share the Let's reference, but go ahead.
You see, these are 2 different sets, and there's on each there's 7 which are distinct, but there's 1 that's the same, and it is, what is it? It's the anchor. It's an anchor on both of these, right? Fano Plains, F-A-N-O. It's a very interesting way of sort of creating a high information dice. 57 sides to this dice, and you can go up. So you can just create larger and larger scales of distinction to be considered. I mean, I think Dave Snowden uses this sort of thing a lot. A bit more of this, a bit less of that. And these are, yeah, well, there's so much here. I'm making it vastly complicated. I'm gonna. So this is the game that we see as viable for children to first begin exploring patterns of monetary process without cognitive engagement until they can see what's there, and will allow us to quite quickly distinguish between money that goes away because it's not your money. That's the way you can tell it's not your money. It goes away and never comes back. But if you make a promise in a community, the money that you've promised is in a loop of karma, community, feedback. And once those two things are distinguished, then the whole thing opens up. And these are the games that we're hopefully going to have as a practical process, perhaps in a month or so. The ones we've got at the moment are not practical.
So basically a way to compare two kinds of money, one that goes out, one that stays in, and a way for kids or for economic analysts to have a look at the same process. And the kids can do it in a very straightforward way, basically keep them on the rails of this process. The economic analyst can take basically the same structure of the game and put into it any kind of conditions that they want and compare two different models of currency in operation in those conditions.
So like a CRISPR lab for money.
Incredible. Ray.
Because what you learn in this process, you can also replicate and do some forward projection. And then the model on which you do the forward projection is also the model that can be implemented in any community, in any banking network, in a joint venture, in a learning community of any nature. So that's what we're aiming for, is an intelligible understanding of what we can do with money that isn't limited by the church of the last 5,000 years. You know, it's a changing. It does come down to Henry George. You know, anybody know, who's up on Henry George? Everybody know Henry George?
We're all fans. It's the cult of mechanism designers unites and buys a billboard in favor of Georgism. I did, and it reminds me of like one particular aspect which I want to come to. And I do, if you need to go, please let us know, and you're more than welcome. We'll just, because this is proving to be a generative conversation, keep it open still for hopefully a little bit of time, if you have some time still, Michael and Gail.
And we've been whirled enough in time.
Yes.
I'll hang it.
Thank you.
I know that Ray has a question, so please, Ray, and then.
Yeah, so I never want to be perceived as saying, let's not play games, but talk to me about what games we should really play, because from my perspective, there's a long history of community currencies over decades, and the real issue seems to be is that they kind of have a sort of a half-life. They die. They literally do just go away. They could be thriving for a while and then they're gone. And I'm not convinced that doing small scale experiments with introducing people to community currencies will do any good when they can move to another community, go away to college, whatever, and suddenly that game isn't available to be played. And we really need to understand more about what are the necessary conditions or the critical mass that's necessary to give a community currency longevity. It should actually endure. Like, we can deploy them left and right, up and down. I could probably get like a bunch of them going this year, but they would mostly all be gone next year. Like, what are the things that we need to make part of the experiment so that the design is around longevity? That's a question that's in my mind that I have no answer for, and I'm hoping that somebody else here has ideas about what are the answers for that? Thank you.
First of all, you're dead right, and also that's a partial description of the situation. Yeah. When I first started looking into this process 40 years ago, the specifics of community currencies, we took examples from commercial barter systems. There's a group called International Reciprocal Trades Association, IRTA, which has been operating essentially a closed let system under rules with a central organizer who takes a slice. And that is why commercial barter is still turning over billions of dollars a year all over the world. And it's got a lot bigger because they sort of control it effectively. Sardex is a good example of the controlled centralization of a give and get system. And they persist if they're well managed. Unfortunately, a lot of management goes sideways. A lot of rule structures get wrong. When we first put out our ideas, we saw people trying to make them safe. Now, if you're trying to ride a bicycle and you freeze the steering, like lock the handlebars, it's unrideable. It's got to have swerve and variety into the process. But we had people building fixed steering, square wheels and racks and wondering why it doesn't go anywhere. Too much imposition of control and perception. And it was a let system from the beginning. That was the word that we had, let it. It wasn't local exchange trading. And I don't know where the words came from. They just sort of happened, but it was an enabling package which was not managed or controlled. And it's not to say that there aren't systems that need management. If you're doing things like player trades in a football league or something where there's $100 million transactions going on, then those players and club managers or whatever are going to be very clear about, we're watching and we want to know what's going on. But in a neighborhood network, much less. And in most of the networks that are going to work, the less control, the more life. And what I've seen, Ray, time and time again, is people trying to squeeze life into the rocks. It doesn't work. This is not a controllable system. You got to let it live. And I've seen plenty of examples that I would describe as, yeah, you see, this is what happens when people are generous and easy with the process rather than at risk and fear. And every time we've seen our systems sort of stop is because somebody has said, the sky is falling. I see the sky is falling. I knew we were deluded in this belief. It can't work. We're out of here. And once you've decided that, it's gone. Now, trying to bring people back from that position is really, really difficult. So we'd rather not. We'd rather start people riding their bicycles and feeling confident in it.
So could we think about a community currency as a commons that should really be governed the way Ostrom says that we should govern? And has anybody ever seen a community money that used core design principles for how to govern its money?
I've discussed that many times. About the Ostrom is about managing scarcity fairly, and that's cool. We're not asking about scarcity. We're looking about what is the common creative capacity, and it doesn't need the Ostrom overlay. Now this is a big shift. So I don't expect this to be dropping and landing, but basically this is, in variety there is hope. I'll put it that way.
If we assume that there are two different ways of doing things, that we give into a non-rivalrous situation, then we give what we have. And we get what other people have. And we don't have to worry about competing for scarce resources because the circulation is in what we have. If we are working in the other realm in which we're having to get, and we're having to hold people to their guarantee that they're going to pay us because the money itself represents value that we will use in getting something that we want. The money itself is scarce, and we're going after something that we also assume is scarce. It freezes everything up in terms of allowing our generosity. What we're looking for is a non-rivalrous exchange. We're looking to design non-rivalrous relationships, even in the presence of business relationships that are traditionally rivalrous. So,
well, in fact, just jumping to this one, sorry to cut
please,
you, Gail,
please.
you know,
Yeah.
this is about scaling. It's my belief that basically this can scale to something like 50% of the economy.
Yes, I think so, but just so that I can stay with you in the argument, I need to clear up an uncertainty that I have. I really want to go back to the question of governance and what Ostrom says, because like I said before, you know, we're really in a symbiosis with our money. There's an ecology. And even if we take away the scarcity of the money itself, there's another side to the commons, which is who are all the people that remain in the community that are willing to use that money, and what extinguishes their willingness to use that money gets at the answer for why community monies disappear. And so I don't think it's about, you know, getting people to play the game. It's about why people quit the game that we really want to try to understand and figure out what are the rules or the mechanisms that keep someone in the game, because that's what would allow a community money to endure. And I don't think that we should pass over that. We should really think hard about what kind of games and experiments we play to answer that question.
So Michael, can I jump in here and suggest that one of the things that is really important is a loss. One of the things that's a game stopper or game slower downer is a loss of perceived variety that's attractive to the individual playing. There was a time in the Let's system when there was a dentist, and everybody who was in that Let's system in Comox, and I wasn't there at the time, I have to say, I joined Michael only a couple of years ago. But during that time, if you were an electrician, you could do some work for somebody and you could get paid in dental work for your kids, which was a remarkably attractive situation. And then the dentist got married and left town, and suddenly there was no dentist. And now we've got a lot of other people who are doing other things, but they aren't quite as juicy. And so people began to say, well, I guess there's nobody playing then. That was one of the things that really slowed things down. And people left because they thought, oh, well, there's nothing to get. There's nothing that will benefit me. And I guess if you're all candle makers in the same town and you're trying to exchange candles with each other, that's probably a problem. But the idea then would be to look for other ways of developing the variety that people want. And this is why we like the business model that that Michael has been developing with others preceding me.
Can I throw in the curveball of the Irish? Whenever in doubt, ask the Irish. Do you remember the Irish bank strike of the 70s? There was a clearinghouse between the chartered banks in Ireland that there was about 10, 20 people in the staffing that they sort of cleared the checks and sent them back to the provincial banks. And of course, if they weren't working, then nobody knew what the balances really were. And they had a strike, and it lasted for a couple of months, got settled. But then they struck again. And for 9 months, the banks in Ireland were closed. But it didn't matter, because the brewers were issuing their staff paychecks in denominations. So I'd get a bill, my wage was not paid in normal money, it was paid in Arthur Guinness signed checks, if you like, or something. And the entire Irish economy operated for a year with the brewers basically being the underwriters localized to particular areas, absolutely unorganized. Now that's
So
what
I would get in my pay packet, I would get, if it was £200, or say it was £260, then I would get £100, two checks, one each of £100, and another one of 50 and another one of 10, so that I'd be able to use those because Guinness had underwritten them, so everybody could trust them.
they worked in the pubs. It was a very good year. We've got a paper on that one, or circulation, or a essay rather than a paper. But it's a pretty well established, the circulation of a substantial gift certificate in a community has that same persistence if it's embedded effectively and it touches what people want, which is basically bread and circuses. You know, people want their necessities. So if you can save your cash flow at the supermarket, if you can save your cash flow at the entertainment, the theater, the craft, education, or beer, then that will keep people's attention very nicely. So that's our entry point. And frankly, I do think it's the brewers who are going to change the world. But also IKEA.
Does that help, Ray?
It's a partial answer.
Yeah, that's all we'll get for a while. Ray, we'll have to have a long conversation about this, and I really invite it. And I think we should keep a good record on it. Yeah. Not trying to cut you off, but.
Well, I mean, like, if we go back to like what Gail was saying, if it's about, you know, the ability to use a community currency, the liquidity, the available to spend it, then that kind of answers for me my question about like the size and scope of games. That small doesn't make sense. It's about scale, because you don't ever just want to have one dentist or one of anything. You want a large enough community that the ability for all participants to spend the community currency is not in doubt.
Yeah. So that's why we're going for municipal taxation. If businesses can pay their municipal taxes in service, rather than trying to squeeze the same blood out of the usual stones, because you've got this problem, most Western democracies, the municipal budget is a problem between the residents who are paying residential tax on their asset, or the businesses that are paying commercial tax on their opportunity. And there's this contention between the two. Well, it will always be fighting for the same scarcity. Now, if on the other hand, the businesses can be contributing to the community in their service, then it's a whole different game. So we've got scaling propositions in here, and our aim is that the game should allow people to play with possibilities to the point where they start realizing what they can do and start imagining it in reality. Because unless we imagine a reality that's going to take us somewhere, we're going to have a very dystopic view of, we're going to have dystopic effects. And I want to see, I want us to see propositions that are not competitive, but can be distributed very effectively and lift all the boats rather than my boat first. We got here, it's ours. So it's not about enclosure, it's about disclosure. It's about each one providing more lift to the other. more metaphors, I'm sorry, Ray, but keep asking that damn question, because that's the one that sticks for everybody. Is this real? Will it work? And it's got to be addressed very accurately, otherwise we're going down the same tunnel.
Dunya, I know that you had some thoughts a little bit earlier, and you were so patient. Would you mind sharing them with us now?
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah, I would love to. I guess I was listening, and there was the moment that this idea of this colonial story or that imperial energy. I saw it, listened to it come up a few times, and even this idea of what's the barriers to playing the game, or hearing, oh, but then there was nothing that to get that you could take, and what's in the way of giving. And when it, and I think that this colonial story is actually not something that we can put under the carpet. And I think I've spoken about this with Ray a bit around this idea of forgiveness, or saying sorry, or grieving, and how can we play with that? Is there a way that yeah, I feel like it's going to be hard to play a game of giving if we don't start by giving the proper apology, or the proper recognition of the yeah, of the history, because you can't, like, yeah, no more words.
Well, it's the guns, germs, and steel. Colonial processes. You come in with the armaments, then you come in with the incompatibilities, the germs. You know, how many processes have happened because of smallpox or whatever. But then you lock it in with the value standard, with the money which does not belong in your place, but takes everything out of it. And that's our biggest problem. We've there was something in the Bible about this: "Thou shalt not make a graven image of me." Now, I really think that's not about little gold idols in the corner of the church or the synagogue. I think it's basically about maps that do not match reality. And we think that these objects of promise, objects of the dollar bill, the tax acceptable legal tender, if that's running our world, then we've got a problem. And I'm looking for a way out of that process. Sorry, I've lost my thread there, Dunya. I'm not sure if you're touching on it, but it's.
Yeah, I'm also not. It's not as if I was looking for something in particular. It's more of an inquiry of how is the whole. I will kill the word ho'oponopono ritual, or something like that, something that we can play a game around, or that there can be a currency of that there's a valuation of that process, because it does feel to me that you can't jump to the, oh, we're gonna all give without that being part of the equation, and how that becomes something that is resourceful, or that is cathartic, perhaps, is a word that we can use. Or
Dunya, can I suggest that when we talk about we're all going to give, or we can all give, the we and all are important. When we're talking about giving within a network, not a closed system exactly, but it is, it's a recognized network of people, then it's a different way to think about it than we all over the world. My money is as good in that part of the world as it is in this part of the world. or my gift is as good. It may not be relevant, but within the network it is. Does that help at all? That we can be generous within different networks. If I have, I can be in a network, or I can be in several different ones depending on my interests. And our generosity is reflected within each of those networks depending on our particular interests. But it isn't an expectation that we all have to give something, or that we are,
or bound by some edict. It's like the balkanization. The primary form of tribal is you're in or you're out, and those guys over there, we don't like them, or whatever. So there's that separation, and you should only be in one tribe. You can't be in several tribes. That's really confusing. But nowadays we're learning that a sort of a neo-tribalism of connections. Like I may be connected in my church or my neighborhood or my food security network or my venture capital or my project. These are all different connectivities, like different parts of the spectrum, different instruments in the band or something. We can have all these things at once rather than being boxed into the legal tender of our nation state, which is a top-down organizational frame. So that's where we're looking for stepping away from the collective of the more of us together model. There's it's a very poor form of organization to say there's more of us than you, so we win, which is really what our society's built itself on for several thousand years. More is better. So we're looking for, oh, I'm losing it again.
Well, we're looking for networks of exchange that are identifiable by their own interests. And
not compulsory, and not limited to it won't work unless we all work, we're all in it. You know, and it's that variety that we don't have to all do this at the same point. So it's an entry point which I think will go through an S curve and reach a saturation at basically everybody in the world will use money that is in loops. It'll be different in different countries, different ways. It'll have different effects, different forms, but we won't be limited to an imposed monocultural, top-down, coercive money. That's my hope. Now, I'm hearing this a lot, the game A, game B distinction. And a lot of people have talked about, okay, what can we create a game B with that will not be enclosed, will not be invaded, will not be gamed by the gamers? And that's where the Eric Frank Russell story really speaks to the choice point. In this deal, you make your own decisions about who you serve and whom you take service from. Who do you hire and who do you work for? What is your gift in that network? The other model would be, I've got the money, you do what I say. And we've had enough of that. So this is a demilitarizing of the monetary model. Things I say. You don't want to believe me. This is the other thing. Don't trust me. Don't take anything on my recommendation, except that you've got to do your own research on this. Like if this doesn't work, I can't teach you to ride a bicycle by telephone. And this is a bit like sending people the parts of a bicycle without even the instructions and expecting them to ride it. So if this doesn't center in your own experience of validity and value and benefit for yourself and those around you, don't do it. And certainly don't believe me. Please. That's a terrible place to go. Trust is a very dangerous thing. It's a good thing for a while. But when you break trust, and almost every time something that is built on trust will crack somewhere, oh, they didn't deliver, I didn't get what I wanted. Well, I'm not doing that again.
Well, we have to be very careful here that when we're talking about trust, we're talking about it in a mercantile or an exchange sense. We're not talking about we're not talking about confidences between friends. We're not talking about that kind of trust. We're talking about this thing for that thing. And then, then you have the issues of, did I get paid enough? Did I get paid properly? Did I get paid on time? Can I trust the other person to do the same, etc.?
The thought that I have here related to Dunya's beautiful point is, what is quite moving about the life and message, them not being separate, of Mahatma Gandhi, is that at the heart of Satyagraha, which is this like non-violence protest, what is captured in the story referenced here, and then there were none, by the very simple acronym FIW, freedom, I won't, right? Like it's this thing that Michael is talking about. I have the choice about who I serve and who I accept service from. But there's something much deeper in Gandhi's philosophy, which is kind of like worth thinking about. And that is that his most creative turn is to have the courage to make that which is most abominable in his culture desirable. And what I mean by that is that in Eastern culture, to imprison another human being is unthinkable, right? On like a philosophical level. I mean, it should be the same across all of the world, but that's perhaps not quite the case, especially in the modern world. But to imprison another human being, to limit their freedom, is like equivalent to a death sentence in many ways, right? And what Gandhi does is he sees this and goes to prison. Right? And all of a sudden, everybody wants to go to prison. And because of that turn and the like creative courage that it takes, the system breaks. Right? So it's just a wonderfully simple, and the way that it's described in that story is like the ultimate weapon. But it's not a weapon of violence, right? And it's not of mass destruction. It's of like this. It's of freedom, right? It's a wonderful weapon, and it's this like non-violent refusal, and it's done in such a way as to make the most undesirable aspects of the system that which we desire the most. And like one of the ways in which to think about this, which is kind of interesting based on that story, is that like there in the story they land on this random planet. Like there's been this massive space exploration. All of the cults and everybody and all of the weird people have left Earth and gone onto their own planets, and there's like all of these crazy things happening across the galaxy basically, and there's like far future, and then they land this like Terran Earth ship with like our traditional modes and cultures and beliefs lands on the planets, and then they're like, we're here to talk with your governments, please will you take us to your leaders? And the people are like, mind your own business. What's wrong with you? They're leaders, and it's just this hilarious unfoldments that follows. And what's interesting is that like they work with these things called obs, or obligations. And when I like do you a favor, basically you can plant an ob on me, and then when we have like if I return that, or if I do a favor for somebody else who you owe an obligation to, then that ob can be harvested, basically. The language that they actually use in the story is kill, but I think harvest is like a plant, and harvest is a nice way of putting it, right? And the thing that makes me think about in terms of like currency design, and particularly what you're talking about, Dunya, in terms of forgiveness, is that like there are really interesting ways in which we can think about playing, like what happens if a token is not an asset but an obligation, right? What happens if owning a lot of tokens is not a good thing? Right? If accumulating a lot of tokens means you hold a lot of obligations. A very interesting like framework, and a very, very simple switch in the nature of the game that changes that which is desirable in the system and might like break certain modes of perception about what money is and how it ought to operate in the world. And like that, because I listen to Michael, I'm like, I love all of this, right? It's amazing and inspiring. And then like, it's hilarious also to me to hear the thing about, like uncertainty, because on a philosophical level, I deeply appreciate that. And on a professional level, I work in a language called Solidity. It's hilarious. Like, okay, cool. I'm going to program uncertainty and solidity. It's just what a time to be alive. But so yeah, I'm very interested in that notion of forgiveness, because like if we can have like obligations, promises, forgiveness, and structure it simply in such a way that, like, for instance, the accumulation of tokens is not the stated goal of the system. That's like an interesting game to play. And Ray, like that kind of, I hear your point on scale, particularly as it applies to community currencies, but like when games like this, you just need one, right? You just need one game to work. That's what Bitcoin is, right? Like it's a woefully underspecified stab in the dark that was 6 pages long, right? And it worked. And we are stuck with the externalities of that. It's not an entirely good thing necessarily, but like it's very interesting that it worked, right? And that here we are having this conversation as a result of that. And so like, yeah, I think that if you can find those kinds of like inversions, which is what I take from Gandhi, then like, yeah, the scale is in like the number of games you can play in your creativity, not the like size of the system. Because if you just get one that works, it seems like that is like a high impact avenue to pursue.
I just point here to the Wars of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells story, where the Martians come and they've got superior technology and they're taking over with the bacteria that got them. This is the bacteria. We've got these corporate devices, the zombies, the Milton Friedman zombies that are running the world at the moment. Shareholder benefit. Got to fulfill for the shareholders, but what about the clients? What about the staff? I mean, what about those who are neither? They just have to tolerate the noise and mess that they're making. Well, we've got mindless zombies running the world. And if we can make them in some way responsible for their actions with benefit, not responsible in terms of, now we'll hold you to task and we're going to break you into little pieces, but rather we can make the corporate world positive rather than destructive. That's why I like the IKEA proposition. And that's another hour or so of conversation, but why not?
So the thing that, like, the doctrine of shareholder responsibility and Bitcoin, what they really have in common is that there's sort of an orthodoxy, like there's a political philosophy that underpins it, which is clearly articulated, and it appeals to a certain sort of person, so that there's at least some segment of the people that advocate for it really strongly. There's a group that is never going to walk away from it the way that people walk away from community currencies, because there's something of a belief system that goes with it. And I think that that's an important but overlooked part of the design of money, is to say, well, what's the belief system that goes with it? Because like that's actually really powerful, right? You can tell people facts all day long, but when you tell them why something is this way, it's so much more memorable, persuasive, and convincing. It's simply harder to argue with.
Well, the balance sheet is the snapshot of my corporation or my life at any moment. It's the noun. It's my accumulation of. And we've run the world on nouns for far too long. Every accumulation is a consequence of the flows to and from. So if we stop looking at the nouns with such a fixation and start watching the verbs, the flows between, because no noun exists without being connected to others. No agent is real. They say no man is an island, each is connected and so on, but well, you know, if you're not connected, you don't exist. So what are the connections and what are the patterns of those connections? And have we got a good relationship to the thermodynamics, the entropy of the process versus the singular acquisition, the idea that if I get more, I'm better off than if I had less, which is the fear-based, was the basis of the balance sheet. What do I own, right? Will this last me into my, will I live forever if I have more? Is the Midas problem.
And also, what do I owe? Who do I have to be afraid of? Maybe that's putting it in a very harsh way, but you know, I mean, when we're trading small stuff, that's maybe not so much importance, but we do sense this tension between us all the time as a result of the way we trade, and we even tell each other, don't mix friendship with business.
That's a very Scottish thing. I think it's time for the Scots to rule the world again. So I'm really looking for a little bit of improvement on Adam Smith and that lot. He wasn't a bad dude, but you see, land was not enclosed when he had his ideas of free market. It was when you had to pay to be anywhere that the game changed. And when you further bias that by making the benefit of winning in the game is that you get to own the game and crush the opposition, which is a very familiar style of the economy at this point, then you've got a problem. So we're trying to shift the concept of ownership from privilege to responsibility. When we talk about returning to an indigenous models, we're not talking about let's get the indigenous world good at Western capitalism. No thanks. But we can bring our Western capitalism into indigenous relationship patterns much more easily. And in fact, I think it's a matter of months, ultimately, to get this thing to click in and run. It's sort of like an Ice 9 thing, if you know Kurt Vonnegut's work, Cat's Cradle. It's pattern forming, and when patterns start to form, they do, and they move very fast.
It's all a matter of getting the help to do it.
Yes, and get me out of here. I'm getting too old and too tired to do this accurately. I noticed the other day, I told, no, I don't mean it in this moment, it's just, I think I'm retiring. I've just realized I'm retiring. I felt so good yesterday evening when I thought, I've got nothing to do tomorrow. Because for the last 40 years, I've been trying to make something simple obvious to people who don't see it. And there's no amount of transmission that can break through, I don't see it. If you don't believe it, you don't see it. So much thanks to Gail's work with me over the last couple of years, which has been tremendously effective. And Charles, et cetera, you know, Philip, the digital co-op and so on. I realized I've done about as much as I can expect to do productively. I'm not going to stop, but obviously the ball is out of my hands. Come on, guys, what you going to do with this? So I'm retiring. Not stopping, retiring.
A wonderful, wonderful place, I think, perhaps to slowly wind up this evening or this morning's conversation or this afternoon's conversation, wherever you are. If there are further comments, queries, jokes, or dance moves, as always, now is the time.
I heard that retiring was going out of style.
We're going to give it a new style.
Have to retire retiring.
Retreading. Something, yeah. But I've been trying to give this away for 30, 40 years. I'm going to stop trying to give it away.
Yeah, I have a teacher who told me once, when you really know the truth, you'll eventually end up in a place where you are paying people to take it. We just have to design the money which makes that possible, right? That's the whole thing.
Yep.
So,
Be your own money.
yeah. Is there any other closing comments on today's discussion? And we will look forward to perhaps some more hair-blasting wind tunnels and games in our next gathering.
Yes,
That's
we're
great.
looking forward certainly to your engagement, your enjoyment, your further discussion. This is a lot of fun. And I want to shout out especially to Charles, who's been able to put us in touch with you. So thank you.
And I've put up our Zoom room there. So if anybody wants to just carry on and rattle about this, I'm happy to hang in for another half hour or so. But
thank you very much. And Charles, as always, for the communal garden. Yeah, doing wonderful work out in the wild web. So thank you. And I will go ahead now and break some copyright laws. End of our recording.